Vietnam, Phuoc Thai Province, 1967. An American liaison lieutenant receives a briefing before heading into the Australian sector. The senior officer unfolds the map, circles the green zone with his finger, and says one sentence: "You snap a twig in there and you're dead, and it won't be the Viet Cong who kill you." This wasn't a bar story from Saigon. This was standard procedure. American patrols were forbidden from entering the Australian SAS area of operations without triple clearance. The reason? Australians shot at sound. Any sound that didn't belong to the jungle. Radio static, creaking gear, the smell of cigarettes, all of it meant death for the enemy, and for any ally who forgot to give warning. The Viet Cong knew this better than anyone. Captured documents from their political officers contained a direct order: Americans can be defeated. They depend on air support and artillery. Australians avoid. They are worse than us. They live in the jungle. 4 men in tennis shoes, reeking of fish sauce, not leaving the bush for weeks. Kill ratio: 500 to 1. Soldiers their own allies feared as much as their enemies did. To understand how a handful of Australians turned Phuoc Tui Province into a zone both sides of the conflict were afraid to enter, we need to start from the very beginning, from the day the first SAS patrol stepped into that jungle. The first Australian SAS soldiers arrived in Vietnam in the year 1966, and from the very first week, American advisors knew something was different. And these men did not move like soldiers. They moved like something older, something that belonged to the forest itself. While American units conducted loud, aggressive search and destroy missions backed by helicopter gunships and artillery barrages, the Australians simply vanished into the green. 4 men, sometimes 5. No radio chatter, no supply drops, no extraction requests for days on end. Pentagon liaison officers began asking uncomfortable questions almost immediately. Where were they? What were they doing? And why did the Viet Cong activity in their sector drop to almost zero within weeks? The answers would take months to piece together. And when they finally emerged, they disturbed American commanders more than any enemy action ever had. The Australian method was built on a single terrifying principle: become the jungle. Not hide in it, not move through it, become it. Before every mission, SAS troopers underwent a transformation that American soldiers found bizarre, even primitive. They stopped using soap 3 days before insertion. They stopped smoking a week prior. They switched their diet from Western rations to rice, fish sauce, and local vegetables. The goal was simple and horrifying in its implications. They wanted their sweat, their breath, their very skin to smell like the Vietnamese countryside, like farmers, like villagers, like the enemy themselves. But that was only the beginning of the metamorphosis. The boots came off. Standard-issue jungle boots, the pride of American military engineering, were discarded like useless relics. In their place, Australian troopers laced up simple canvas tennis shoes, Dunlop volleys, the same cheap sneakers Australian teenagers wore to beach parties. American special forces laughed when they first saw this. They stopped laughing when they understood why. Jungle boots left a distinctive track, deep heel impressions, geometric tread patterns, unmistakable evidence that Western soldiers had passed through. Viet Cong trackers could follow these prints for kilometers. They could estimate unit size, direction of travel, even the physical condition of the soldiers by analyzing the depth and spacing of the tracks. They used this information to set ambushes, plant mines, and call in reinforcements. American patrols were being hunted by the very trails they left behind. The Dunlop volleys left almost nothing, a faint impression that could belong to anyone. A farmer walking to his field, a child running through the forest. The canvas dried in minutes after river crossings, eliminating the squelching sounds that betrayed wet leather boots. The thin soles allowed troopers to feel twigs and dry leaves beneath their feet, letting them avoid the snapping sounds that meant death in the silent jungle. For the Australians, footwear was not about comfort or protection. It was about becoming invisible. And yet the Americans still had not grasped the full scope of what they were witnessing. The SAS patrol structure itself was an affront to everything American military doctrine held sacred. U.S. Army patrols operated in platoon strength or larger, 30 men minimum, often more. The logic was straightforward. More men meant more firepower, more security, more options if contact occurred. This was the lesson of 2 world wars. Mass and mobility, concentrate force and overwhelm the enemy. The Australians rejected this entirely, and their standard patrol consisted of 5 men. and sometimes 4, occasionally, for the most sensitive reconnaissance missions, just 3. American advisors were appalled. This was suicide, they insisted. A 5-man team had no reserves, no fire support within the unit, no ability to sustain casualties and continue the mission. If they made contact with a larger enemy force, they would be annihilated. The Australians smiled politely at these objections. And then they went into the jungle and proved every American assumption wrong. The logic was counterintuitive but devastating in its effectiveness. A 30-man patrol could not hide. It left trails. It made noise. It required constant resupply. It announced its presence through sheer mass. The enemy always knew when Americans were coming. They could hear the helicopters from 10 kilometers away. They could smell the cigarette smoke from half a kilometer. They could see the trails of crushed vegetation from the air. American patrols were not hunting the Viet Cong. They were advertising their location and hoping the enemy would be foolish enough to attack prepared positions. The Viet Cong were not foolish. They simply waited for the Americans to pass, then resumed operations, or they ambushed the patrols on their own terms at times and places of their choosing. The massive American sweeps captured terrain but not enemies. They generated impressive body counts that often included civilians and sometimes pure fabrications. They won battles but were losing the war. The 5-man SAS patrol operated on opposite principles. It could not win a sustained firefight, so it avoided sustained firefights entirely. Its purpose was not to destroy enemy forces through direct combat. Its purpose was to find them, fix them, and guide destruction onto them from above, or, more disturbingly, to eliminate them silently and vanish before anyone knew tragedy had visited. What followed shattered every assumption American intelligence had about small unit warfare. The Australians developed a method of movement that American soldiers found almost supernatural. They called it ghost walking. Each step was placed with deliberate precision, the foot rolling from heel to toe in a motion that distributed weight gradually and silently. Hands moved ahead of the body, gently parting vegetation rather than pushing through it. Progress was measured in meters per hour, not kilometers per day. A patrol might spend an entire morning moving 200 meters to reach an observation position. This was not warfare, as Americans understood it. This was hunting, patient, silent, predatory hunting, the kind practiced by Aboriginal trackers in the Australian outback for 40,000 years, and that connection was not metaphorical. Several SAS troopers had trained directly with Aboriginal elders before deployment. They learned to read the jungle as a text written in bent grass, disturbed insects, and faint scent trails. They learned that humans leave traces invisible to untrained eyes, but screaming obvious to those who know where to look. A broken spider web meant someone had passed within hours. Disturbed leaf litter indicated direction of travel. The behavior of birds and monkeys revealed human presence more reliably than any electronic sensor. But the Aboriginal influence went deeper than tracking. It reached into the psychology of the hunt itself. Traditional Aboriginal hunting required becoming the prey, understanding its patterns, its fears, its daily rhythms. A hunter who thought like a kangaroo could predict where the kangaroo would flee. A hunter who thought like a Viet Cong soldier could predict where that soldier would camp, what trails he would use, and where he would feel safe enough to let down his guard. The SAS troopers began to think like their enemy, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a complete mental transformation. They studied captured documents obsessively. They memorized Viet Cong organizational structures, recognition signals, and tactical doctrines. They learned which units operated in their sector, who commanded them, and what those commanders' habits and weaknesses were. When they entered the jungle, they did not search randomly. They went precisely where the enemy would be, and then the real horror began. The first indication American intelligence had that something unusual was happening came from radio intercepts. Viet Cong units operating in Phuoc Tuy province began reporting strange losses, patrols that never returned, sentries found with their throats opened and no sign of the attacker, supply caches that exploded days after being inspected and declared safe. The reports had a quality American analysts had never seen before in enemy communications. Fear. The Viet Cong were afraid. This was not the cautious respect they showed for American firepower. That could be managed through proper tactics and dispersal. This was something different. This was the primal terror of being hunted by something they could not see, could not hear, and could not understand. Captured documents began referencing the Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts, phantoms that came in the night and left nothing but lifeless bodies. American liaison officers stationed at Nui Dat, the Australian base, began hearing fragments of what was happening in the field. The stories were difficult to believe. A four-man patrol ambushing a Viet Cong company and disappearing before the survivors could organize a response. Enemy soldiers found with their boots cut at the ankles, a psychological message that spread terror through Viet Cong ranks. Entire base camps discovered empty, abandoned in panic after a single SAS sighting. But what disturbed the Americans most was not the neutralizing. It was the silence. American after-action reports were filled with detailed accounts of firefights, ammunition expenditure, enemy casualties, duration of contact, supporting fires called. The reports from Australian SAS patrols were sparse to the point of incomprehension. Four-line summaries for missions lasting weeks. Observed enemy movement, engaged, withdrew. No details, no drama, no requests for medals or recognition. When pressed for more information, the Australians would shrug. The mission was accomplished. What more was there to say? This attitude maddened American commanders obsessed with metrics and body counts. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara had transformed the war into a numbers game. Success was measured in enemy casualties, weapons captured, territory swept. The more bodies, the closer to victory. This logic drove American strategy and determined career advancement for ambitious officers. The Australians refused to play this game. They considered body counting vulgar, a distraction from the real purpose of military operations. When American liaison officers demanded detailed casualty figures, the SAS provided estimates so conservative they seemed almost dismissive. American commanders suspected the Australians were hiding their true effectiveness. They were right, but not for the reasons they imagined. The truth was simpler and more disturbing. The SAS did not count bodies because counting bodies required staying in the elimination zone, and staying in the elimination zone meant becoming a target. The Australian method was to strike and vanish, leaving the enemy to discover their losses hours or days later. By then, the patrol was kilometers away, already hunting the next target, but the statistics that eventually emerged told a story that shook American confidence to its core. Over the course of the war, Australian SAS conducted thousands of patrols in Phuoc Thai province. They made contact with enemy forces hundreds of times. They suffered a total of 2 men lost in direct combat, 2 against an enemy that was taking down American soldiers by the thousands. The ratio calculations were almost impossible to process. Conservative estimates placed it at 500 to 1. Some analyses suggested it was even higher. American Special Forces units, the best the U.S. military had to offer, operated at ratios of perhaps 50 to 1 in their most successful operations. The Australians were an order of magnitude more lethal. Pentagon analysts initially dismissed these figures as errors or exaggerations. They sent inspection teams to verify the Australian claims. What those teams discovered did not reassure them. If anything, it deepened their unease. The Australians were not exaggerating. They were understating. The inspection teams observed SAS operations firsthand. They watched 5-man patrols disappear into jungle that American battalions had declared impassable. They monitored radio frequencies that remained silent for days. While the patrols were operational, they reviewed after-action reports that documented contact after contact with no friendly casualties, and they interviewed the troopers themselves, trying to understand how this was possible. The answers were unsettling precisely because they were so simple. One American major, a veteran of 3 tours with Mac VSOG, spent 2 weeks at Nui Dat studying SAS methods. His classified report, later partially declassified, contained a single paragraph that summarized his findings. The Australians have rediscovered something we forgot. War is not about technology or firepower. It is about men who are willing to become something less than civilized to survive. They have become predators. We are still thinking like soldiers. Yet even this assessment missed the darkest elements of Australian methodology. The night operations revealed the true nature of what the Australians had become. American forces in Vietnam feared the darkness. Nighttime belonged to the enemy. Viet Cong units moved their supplies after sunset, knowing that American air power was largely ineffective without daylight. They launched attacks in the pre-dawn hours when sentries were exhausted and reaction times slowed. The night was their ally, their protector, their weapon. The Australians inverted this equation entirely. SAS patrols actively sought night operations. They moved through the jungle in absolute darkness, navigating by touch and sound, and the faint glow of stars filtered through the canopy. They had trained for this in Australia, spending weeks in lightless conditions until their other senses compensated for the loss of vision. By the time they reached Vietnam, darkness was not a disadvantage, it was an amplifier of their already formidable capabilities. And the technique they developed was called close target reconnaissance. It was exactly as terrifying as the name suggested. A four-man patrol would approach an enemy base camp in the final hours before dawn. They would move the last 200 meters on their bellies, inching forward centimeter by centimeter, feeling for tripwires and pressure plates with their fingertips. They would penetrate the perimeter without disturbing the sentries, and then they would spend hours inside the enemy camp itself, counting soldiers, identifying command structures, mapping defensive positions, sometimes close enough to touch sleeping Viet Cong fighters. American Special Forces had conducted similar operations, but never with the same frequency or audacity. The risks were extreme. Discovery meant certain end, surrounded by enemies with no possibility of rescue or support. Yet the Australians conducted these missions routinely, treating them as standard intelligence gathering procedures rather than exceptional acts of courage. What they learned during these nocturnal infiltrations proved invaluable. They discovered that Viet Cong units in Puoc Tuy had developed specific protocols for dealing with Australian patrols. Standing orders prohibited pursuit of SAS teams that had been spotted. Commanders had learned through bitter experience that following the Australians into the jungle meant walking into ambushes prepared by men who knew exactly where pursuit would come from. It was safer to let them go and hope they would not return. But the Australians always returned. The intelligence gathered during close target reconnaissance fed directly into ambush planning. SAS teams would identify enemy movement patterns, locate the trails they used, determine the times they traveled, and then position themselves along those routes with mathematical precision. When the ambush was triggered, it was not a chance encounter. It was an execution. The standard SAS ambush configuration was designed for maximum lethality and minimum exposure. 4 or 5 men positioned in a shallow L shape, covering overlapping fields of fire. Each man knew exactly which sector he was responsible for and exactly when to initiate. The elimination zone was typically no more than 30 meters long, designed to catch an entire enemy squad within the beaten zone simultaneously. When the first round was fired, the engagement was already over. The volume of fire from 5 automatic weapons at close range, concentrated on a small group of men caught completely by surprise, was unsurvivable. Engagements lasted seconds. The Australians would empty their magazines into the zone, reload, and then wait in absolute silence. If there was any movement, they fired again. If not, they would wait longer, listening for sounds of reinforcement or survivors attempting to crawl away. Then they would vanish. Standard doctrine called for the patrol to withdraw immediately after confirming their work. They did not search bodies except in specific intelligence-gathering operations. They did not collect weapons or equipment. They did not call for extraction. They simply melted back into the jungle and began moving toward their next position, often kilometers away. By the time enemy forces arrived to investigate the sound of gunfire, there was nothing to find but their own fallen. This methodology drove Viet Cong commanders to distraction. They could not prevent the ambushes because they could not find the ambushers. They could not pursue because pursuit led to more ambushes. They could not predict where the Australians would strike next because the SAS varied their patterns constantly, never using the same ambush site twice, never establishing routines that could be exploited. The cumulative effect was psychological devastation. Viet Cong soldiers in Puoc Tuy began exhibiting symptoms that American military psychologists would later recognize as combat fatigue, accelerated by uncertainty. The stress of conventional combat was manageable because it was predictable. You knew when a battle was happening. You knew where the enemy was. You could prepare mentally for the violence. Fighting the Australians offered no such predictability. The end came without warning, from enemies who were never seen before they struck. Every jungle trail became a potential trap. Every night march carried the possibility of annihilation. Every moment of relaxation was shadowed by the knowledge that the Ma Rung might already be watching, waiting, preparing to strike. Documents captured later in the war revealed the extent of this psychological damage. Unit commanders reported that soldiers refused to move through areas known to be patrolled by Australians. Some men deserted rather than accept assignments to Puoc Tuy. Others developed nervous conditions that rendered them unfit for combat. The fear was not abstract. It was visceral, immediate, and debilitating. Yet the Americans remained largely unaware of this dimension of the Australian campaign. But what truly separated the SAS from every other force in Vietnam was their approach to psychological warfare. The cut boots became their signature. When an SAS patrol neutralized an enemy soldier, they would sometimes slice the canvas of his boots at the ankle, leaving the footwear intact but unwearable. Then they would leave the body where it would be found by other Viet Cong forces. The message was unmistakable. We were close enough to touch your fallen. We chose not to take his equipment. We are not here for supplies. We are here for you. This practice spread terror through Viet Cong units far more effectively than any conventional military operation. Soldiers who found their comrades with cut boots knew that the Ma Rung had been there. They knew that they themselves could have been the targets. They knew that the next patrol might be their last. Morale in units operating near Australian sectors plummeted. Desertion rates climbed. Recruitment became nearly impossible in villages that had heard the stories, but the psychological operations went further still. There were reports, never officially confirmed but too consistent to dismiss, of bodies arranged in specific positions to maximize psychological impact. Enemy fallen placed in poses that suggested they had been taken without resistance. Weapons laid out beside them, unfired, demonstrating that they never had a chance to fight back. These displays were not acts of cruelty, they were calculated messages designed to spread through the enemy's communication networks and undermine the fighting spirit of entire regiments. American intelligence officers were troubled by these reports. They raised questions about compliance with the laws of armed conflict, about proportionality, about the treatment of enemy fallen. The Australians listened politely to these concerns, and then they continued doing exactly what they had been doing. The effectiveness could not be denied. One captured Viet Cong political officer provided testimony that was circulated at the highest levels of American command. He stated that his unit had received explicit orders to avoid contact with Australian forces at all costs, not because they were numerous or well armed, but because they could not be found. They could not be fixed. They could not be engaged on terms that offered any chance of survival. His exact words, translated from Vietnamese, "The Americans we can defeat. They are predictable. They are loud. They depend on machines. The Australians are different. They are in the jungle. They are part of the jungle. We cannot fight the jungle itself." The sentiment was not unique. It appeared repeatedly in captured documents throughout the war. Viet Cong commanders learned to route their supply lines around Phuoc Tuy province, adding days to their journeys rather than risk crossing Australian territory. Main force units that had mauled American battalions simply refused to enter the Australian sector. The enemy's own internal communications revealed a level of fear that American forces had never managed to inspire. What made this even more remarkable was the size of the Australian commitment. At peak strength, the Australian SAS squadron in Vietnam numbered approximately 150 men total. 150 soldiers controlling a province that American planners had estimated would require a full division to pacify. 10,000 American soldiers, or 150 Australians. The arithmetic was impossible, and yet the results were undeniable. The Americans searched desperately for explanations. Perhaps Australian soldiers were simply more physically capable. Perhaps their training was superior. Perhaps they benefited from some classified technology the Pentagon did not know about. Each theory was investigated. Each was found wanting. The physical standards were comparable. Australian selection was brutal, yes, but no more so than American Special Forces qualification. The training differed in emphasis but not in rigor, and the technology was actually inferior by American standards. The Australians carried older weapons, wore non-standard equipment, and operated with communications gear a generation behind what MAC-VSOG used. The difference was not physical or technological, it was philosophical. American military doctrine in Vietnam was built on a fundamental assumption: superior firepower wins wars. When in doubt, call for air support. When ambushed, establish fire superiority. When attacking, soften the target with artillery first. The enemy could not match American munitions production, so victory was ultimately a matter of ammunition expenditure. This doctrine made perfect sense in conventional warfare. Against the Japanese in the Pacific or the Germans in Europe, it had proven devastatingly effective, but Vietnam was not a conventional war. The enemy did not hold territory that could be bombarded. They did not mass forces that could be targeted. They disappeared into a population that either supported them or feared them too much to resist. The Australian rejection of this doctrine was complete and deliberate. They understood that firepower was meaningless against an enemy you could not find. They understood that helicopters announced your presence and artillery told the enemy exactly where you were. They understood that the war would not be won by destroying the jungle, but by mastering it. And they understood that mastering the jungle required abandoning everything that made soldiers comfortable and civilized. This was the transformation that horrified and fascinated American observers. Young men from Sydney and Melbourne and Perth, raised in one of the most modern and comfortable societies on earth, voluntarily reducing themselves to something primitive, eating rice and fish sauce, sleeping in the mud without shelter, going weeks without speaking above a whisper, hunting human beings with knives and rifles and bare hands when necessary. The relationship between American and Australian forces on the ground was more complex than official histories suggest. At the operational level, there was grudging cooperation. Australian intelligence was too valuable to ignore. American commanders routinely requested SAS reconnaissance of areas they planned to assault, knowing that the Australians would provide accurate, detailed information that their own forces could not obtain. These requests were generally honored, though not without friction. The friction arose from fundamental differences in military culture. American officers operated within a hierarchical system that demanded immediate response to orders from above. When a general in Saigon decided that a particular area needed to be swept, battalions moved within hours. The operational tempo was relentless, driven by political pressure to demonstrate progress and the bureaucratic need to justify resource allocation. Australian officers operated with far more autonomy. Their commanders trusted them to make tactical decisions based on local conditions rather than strategic imperatives generated thousands of miles away. When an Australian SAS commander determined that a particular operation was tactically unsound, he would simply decline to conduct it. This shocked American counterparts accustomed to reflexive obedience. One incident became legendary among special operations personnel of both nations. An American colonel requested Australian SAS support for a large-scale sweep operation in a border region. The operation called for the Australians to act as a blocking force, preventing enemy units from escaping the advancing American battalions. The SAS commander examined the plan and refused. His reasoning was blunt. The proposed blocking positions were tactically indefensible. His teams would be exposed to counterattack without adequate support. The noise of the American advance would alert every enemy unit in the area, giving them ample time to disperse before the blocking force could be relevant. The entire operation was designed for impressive statistics rather than actual results. The American colonel was furious. He demanded compliance. He threatened to file reports through channels. He invoked the authority of MACV headquarters. The Australian commander listened politely, then repeated his refusal. His men would not be sacrificed for an operation he considered poorly conceived. The sweep went ahead without Australian participation. It achieved negligible results at significant cost. The Australian assessment had been correct. This incident was not unique. Throughout the war, Australian commanders resisted pressure to conform their operations to American templates. They maintained their own doctrine, their own methods, their own standards. This independence frustrated American planners, but also earned respect among those who understood what the Australians were accomplishing. The Green Berets were perhaps the most receptive audience for Australian lessons. Unlike conventional American forces, Special Forces personnel had the training and mindset to appreciate what the SAS was doing. They recognized the sophistication beneath the apparent simplicity. They understood that the barefoot patrol technique was not primitivism, but advanced fieldcraft. They saw that the tiny patrol sizes were not recklessness, but calculated optimization. Several Green Beret teams attempted to adopt Australian methods within their own operations. Some achieved notable success. The concept of going native in terms of diet and hygiene spread through Special Forces circles, though it never became official doctrine. Individual operators who had worked alongside Australians brought elements of SAS tradecraft back to their own units. But institutional adoption remained impossible. The American system demanded accountability at every level. Every bullet expended required documentation. Every patrol required radio checks at specified intervals. Every operation required approval through multiple headquarters. This bureaucratic infrastructure was designed to maintain control and prevent abuses. It also made Australian-style operations virtually impossible. An SAS patrol could go silent for a week. No communication, no resupply, no confirmation of survival. American forces could not operate this way. Regulations required regular contact. Commanders needed to know where their men were. The entire support structure was built around constant communication. When American units went silent, rescue operations were launched, helicopters were dispatched, artillery was prepared. The assumption was always that silence meant disaster. This assumption was sometimes correct, but it also meant that American patrols could never achieve the invisibility that made SS operations so effective. The Australians exploited this difference mercilessly. Viet Cong intelligence had learned to track American units by monitoring their radio traffic. Even encrypted communications revealed patterns. Regular check-ins at predictable times told the enemy when and roughly where American patrols were operating. The absence of traffic indicated safe areas where movement would not be observed. The Australians generated no traffic to monitor. They moved through the jungle as radio silent as the animals they had learned to imitate. Enemy signals intelligence could not track what it could not detect. This gave SAS patrols an additional layer of invisibility beyond their physical concealment. The cumulative effect of these advantages was difficult to overstate. American forces operated in an environment where the enemy always had some idea of their presence and movements. The Viet Cong knew when helicopters were active, when artillery was registering, when patrols were in the field. They could plan around these known factors, avoiding contact when conditions favored the Americans and attacking when they did not. Against the Australians, no such planning was possible. The SAS could be anywhere or nowhere. Their presence was only revealed when they chose to reveal it, which was usually after they had already achieved their objectives. The enemy was forced into a permanent defensive posture, never knowing when or where the strike would come. This constant uncertainty degraded Viet Cong effectiveness far beyond the direct casualties inflicted. Military theorists call this area denial through persistent threat. A force does not need to be physically present everywhere to control an area. It merely needs to be capable of appearing anywhere at any time with lethal effect. The enemy must then assume the threat is everywhere, dispersing his resources and attention across possibilities rather than concentrating them against certainties. The Australians achieved this effect with impossibly small numbers. Their reputation, carefully cultivated through psychological operations and ruthless efficiency, multiplied their actual capability many times over. 150 men controlled a province because the enemy believed those 150 men could be anywhere within that province at any moment. This was not an accident. It was deliberate strategy, executed with patience and precision. The SAS understood that their real weapon was not their rifles or their training, but the fear they generated. Every silent neutralization, every marked body left as a warning, every patrol that vanished without trace and reappeared kilometers away contributed to an atmosphere of terror that no amount of firepower could have created. American commanders focused on tangible metrics missed this entirely. They counted bodies and found the numbers unimpressive by their standards. They measured territory and noted that the Australians held only one province. They calculated force ratios and wondered why such a small unit received so much attention. What they failed to count was the empty space where the enemy no longer dared to operate. What they failed to measure was the supply routes abandoned, the operations canceled, the fighters demoralized. What they failed to calculate was the psychological multiplication that turned 150 men into an omnipresent threat. The institutional blindness had consequences that extended far beyond Vietnam. When the war ended, American military planners conducted extensive analyses of what had gone wrong. They examined strategy, tactics, logistics, and politics. They generated thousands of pages of lessons learned and recommendations for the future. And yet, the Australian experience barely registered in these assessments. The reasons were partly bureaucratic. Australian operations fell outside the scope of most American review processes. Different command structure, different reporting chains, different institutional memory. The records existed, but were not integrated into the main body of American analysis. The reasons were also partly psychological. Acknowledging the Australian achievement required acknowledging American shortcomings, at least in relative terms. This was uncomfortable for an institution that had just suffered its first unambiguous defeat. The natural response was to focus on factors within American control, rather than comparisons that highlighted limitations. So the lessons remained unlearned, and American forces went on to repeat many of the same mistakes in subsequent conflicts. The emphasis on technology over fieldcraft persisted. American military procurement continued to favor complex systems over trained operators. Billions of dollars went into sensors and drones and precision munitions, while basic skills like tracking and silent movement atrophied. The reliance on firepower over patience persisted. When American forces encountered irregular enemies in later decades, the instinct was always to escalate force rather than adapt methods. More bombs, more artillery, more raids. The idea that less visible violence might be more effective remained alien to institutional culture. The bureaucratic demand for metrics persisted. Commanders continued to be evaluated on quantifiable outputs rather than strategic outcomes. Body counts were replaced by other measures, but the fundamental fixation on numbers remained. If it could not be counted, it did not matter. A few individuals remembered the lessons of Phuoc Tui. Special operations communities in several countries studied the Australian experience and incorporated elements into their own doctrine. The modern emphasis on small unit operations with minimal footprint owes something to the SAS example. So does the recognition that psychological effects can outweigh physical destruction. But these insights remained confined to specialized communities. The broader military institutions of the Western world continued to operate on assumptions that the Australians had disproven half a century ago. Perhaps this was inevitable. Large organizations resist fundamental change. They are designed for consistency and predictability, not adaptation. The very structures that make them effective in conventional operations make them resistant to unconventional thinking. The SAS succeeded in Vietnam partly because they were not constrained by these structures. Their small size permitted flexibility. Their distance from higher headquarters allowed autonomy. Their national military culture valued practical results over procedural compliance. These conditions enabled innovation that larger, more bureaucratic forces could not match. Whether such conditions can be replicated at scale remains an open question. The history of military reform suggests that they cannot. Institutions absorb and neutralize challenges to their core assumptions. The revolutionary becomes routine, and routine becomes orthodoxy. The cycle continues. But for a few years in a small province of South Vietnam, something different was possible. A handful of men demonstrated what could be achieved when doctrine yielded to reality. When technology served skill rather than replacing it, when the ancient wisdom of the hunter was combined with modern weapons and communications, they did not win the war. The war was not winnable by military means alone, but they showed what winning might look like in the small, immediate sense that matters to soldiers. They dominated their environment, they terrorized their enemies, they protected their comrades, and they survived. The survival was perhaps the most remarkable achievement of all. Wars consume men. Even victorious wars leave fields of graves and hospitals full of shattered survivors. The Vietnam War was particularly voracious, feeding on youth and idealism and bodies at rates that shocked even hardened military planners. American casualties exceeded 58,000 fallen. Vietnamese casualties numbered in the millions. The Australian SAS lost 2 men in combat. This statistic demands examination because it seems impossible. How could a unit engaged in constant, close-range combat against a determined enemy suffer so few losses? The answer illuminates everything else about Australian methods. They did not accept fair fights. Every engagement was designed for overwhelming local advantage. The ambushes were conducted from positions that allowed immediate withdrawal. The reconnaissance missions emphasized avoidance over confrontation. The patrols moved through terrain that offered escape routes in multiple directions. When contact occurred unexpectedly, Australian doctrine called for immediate, violent action followed by rapid disengagement. They did not stand and fight. They struck and ran. They understood that prolonged combat favored the enemy, who could always bring more forces to bear given enough time. This was not cowardice. It was tactical wisdom refined through generations of special operations experience. The SAS existed to accomplish missions, not to prove courage through casualties. Fallen soldiers accomplished nothing. Wounded soldiers consumed resources. The best outcome was always to complete the mission and return with every man intact. American military culture sometimes struggled with this calculus. The mythology of heroic last stands, of fighting to the last man, of never retreating in the face of the enemy. This mythology was deeply embedded in American military identity. Soldiers who withdrew from combat could face accusations of cowardice, regardless of tactical circumstances. The Australians had no such mythology to overcome. Their culture valued survival and effectiveness over glorious endings. A soldier who accomplished his mission and returned alive was more valuable than one who perished accomplishing the same mission. This pragmatic approach saved lives without compromising operational success. The combination of skill, patience, tactical wisdom, and institutional support produced results that seemed miraculous to outside observers. But there was no miracle. There was only the systematic application of principles that any military force could adopt if it were willing to challenge its own assumptions. The willingness was what distinguished the Australians. They came to Vietnam without the burden of American preconceptions. They had no massive logistical infrastructure demanding utilization. They had no political pressure for visible progress measured in body counts. They had no institutional investment in doctrines that were failing. They came with open minds and empty hands, ready to learn from the environment and adapt to its demands. And the jungle taught them lessons that transformed them into something unprecedented. The Viet Cong never adapted to the Australian threat. They could not. Their entire tactical system was designed to exploit the weaknesses of conventional forces, and the Australians were not conventional. They were something new, something that combined modern military capability with ancient hunting skills, something that operated by rules the Viet Cong had never encountered. Other enemies might have learned. Given enough time and enough casualties, the Viet Cong might have developed counter-tactics, but time and casualties were exactly what the Australians denied them. The pressure was constant, the losses steady, the fear unrelenting. There was no space for adaptation, no respite for analysis, no opportunity for institutional learning. This was the final lesson of Phu Oc Tuy. Dominance is not achieved through single decisive actions, but through sustained pressure that denies the enemy any chance to recover and adapt. The Australians understood this instinctively. They did not seek dramatic victories. They sought constant, grinding superiority that slowly crushed the enemy's will to resist. By the end of the Australian deployment, Phu Oc Tuy was the most pacified province in South Vietnam, not because the enemy had been destroyed, but because he had been broken. The Viet Cong infrastructure that had taken years to build had been dismantled through patient, relentless pressure. The population that had once supported or tolerated the guerrillas had shifted allegiance to whichever side seemed likely to protect them. The balance had tipped. Whether this balance would have held without Australian presence is unknowable. The war ended before the question could be tested. American withdrawal, followed by North Vietnamese victory, swept away the local arrangements that the Australians had so carefully constructed. But for those who were there, for the soldiers and commanders and intelligence officers who witnessed what 150 men accomplished, the memory remained. It remained as a challenge to comfortable assumptions and established doctrines. It remained as proof that another way was possible. The Ma Rung have passed into legend now. The young men who earned that name have become old men with grandchildren who cannot quite believe the stories. The jungle has reclaimed the patrol bases and ambush sites. The war itself has become history, studied in academies and debated in seminars, but the questions they raised remain unanswered. Could their methods be scaled? Could large military organizations adopt small unit principles without losing the coordination that makes them effective? Could technology enhance rather than replace human skills? Could modern soldiers learn to become what those Australians became? The answers matter because the wars continue. Irregular conflicts against determined enemies in difficult terrain remain the dominant form of military engagement. The conditions that made Australian methods so effective in Vietnam exist in dozens of contemporary battlefields. The lessons are available to anyone willing to learn them. Whether they will be learned is another question entirely. The historical record suggests pessimism. Institutions protect themselves against disruptive knowledge. Careers are built on existing doctrines. Procurement systems favor familiar solutions. The gravitational pull of orthodoxy is immense. But somewhere, in some small unit facing impossible odds against an enemy who knows the terrain better, the spirit of the Ma Rung might emerge again, not as imitation but as rediscovery. The principles are eternal. patience, skill, adaptation, ruthlessness, fear. They were not invented by the Australians, they were merely remembered by them. The jungle taught those lessons 40,000 years ago to the first human hunters who entered it. It taught them again to the Aboriginal trackers who passed their knowledge to young soldiers from Sydney and Melbourne. It will teach them again to whoever's willing to listen. The Marung were not supernatural, they were not superhuman, they were ordinary men who learned to become extraordinary through discipline, training, and the willingness to abandon everything comfortable in pursuit of effectiveness. That transformation is available to anyone. The question is whether anyone will make it. The jungles of Vietnam are quiet now. The ghosts have departed, but somewhere in the world at this very moment, a small patrol is preparing to enter hostile territory. They carry modern weapons and wear modern equipment. They have satellite communications and drone support and precision munitions on call. And perhaps, if they are wise, they also carry the memory of men who needed none of those things. Men who walked in canvas shoes through the darkness and struck without warning and vanished without trace. Men who proved that the most dangerous weapon in any war is not technology, but the human being who wields it. The Ma Rung are gone. Their legacy remains.